So today, I'd like to talk about time. What time is it, and how does a computer know that? My day job, I'm high performance computing, and high performance computing, when you're trying to measure is something faster than something else, you want to know what time it is so that you can say start a clock, do some work, stop the clock, and that's fine. If it's tens of seconds, you can just use regular time stuff, but if it's like hundreds of nanoseconds, how can you be sure you're getting the time right? But in general, the same process is used to find out what time it is, like wall clock time, is it 3:30 in the afternoon, right? The same sort of principles applied. So I want to start with that. So first of all, my first computer, the ZX Spectrum, and then later the BBC Micro, they both kept time. Well, they didn't really keep time. They didn't know what time it was outside in the real world. They just knew how much time had passed, because 50 times a second, there was an interrupt, we've talked about those before, an interrupt that says, hey, the video chip is about to start drawing the screen again, in time with the picture that was going out to the TV. That's a convenient time to just add one to a counter so that you know that 1 more 50th of a second has gone past. And so then in your basic program, when you're saying print the time, it's just looking at whatever that counter was and dividing it by 50, and that's how many seconds have passed since the computer turned on. And then, they got fancy with battery-backed things that had a little clock, an actual clock that knew what the actual time was. And then when it started up, it just read that clock time, and then it started adding to it 50 times a second or whatever. So great stuff, great stuff. Modern computers need to know the time at a slightly better granularity than 50 times a second. A 50th of a second is, an eternity for the kind of things that we do these days. And so most CPUs, since the early 2000s, have a counter in them that ticks up, that's automatically ticking up at a much higher rate than our 50 times a second. So on the computer that I'm recording this on over here, the counter goes up at 3 gigahertz, which is pretty fast, but that's kind of also the speed of the computer. So you could think that maybe I could measure the speed of individual instructions with that. And maybe we'll get to that at the end. But I want to talk about, first of all, how we take that number and we make it a useful number for us. Right at the beginning of the day, you turn your computer on, and that counter starts at 0. So we need to, first of all, we now know how long it is. At any time, we can ask how long it is since the computer turned on. And so somewhere around boot up time, you could imagine the operating system goes off to the network, or goes off to the battery-backed clock that lives inside your BIOS or whatever, and says, hey, what time do you think it is? Let me just remember that. Now I've got is a sort of starting point, a base offset, and then I can add however many nanoseconds have passed. But this counter doesn't measure nanoseconds. It measures, as I say, in my particular computer's case, 3 gigahertz. How do I know what the frequency of my computer is when I don't have anything to measure it by until I've got it running? Right? So there are some tricks. Sometimes, older machines would use an interrupt. So back into the old days, they would sort of set an interrupt to say, call me back in 200 milliseconds from some other part of the hardware. And they would just literally measure it and say how many million ticks of this counter have gone past. But modern ones actually tell you what they think their crystal is set to. So you can actually ask the CPU, how fast is your clock going up? And it'll say 3 gigahertz. Now, the problem with the computer telling you that it goes up at 3 gigahertz, that is what it thought it was happening when it was set at the factory. Now, you probably are well aware that, your Casio watch from 1980, although it was, supposed to be ticking however many, times that it was being counted to get, how many seconds per day, it would be off by, a second or two a day. And it doesn't take very much for your clock to be off before suddenly you're losing time by the end of the day. So something else is going on. So let's talk about what happens. Right, so concretely, and I'm going to talk about the x86 here because it's the bit I know, but the ARM machines have a similar instruction and they have a similar counter and they know about these things. So the x86 has an instruction called RDTSC. You know how instructions, they love to squish letters together and make it completely unreadable rather than, the nice high-level languages stuff here. This stands for Read Timestamp Counter. This gets the number of whatever that counter currently has. It puts in a couple of registers. We can do some maths with it, which is what we're going to do. So what we want to try and work out is how many nanoseconds has it been since some epoch. And in Unix world, which is where I live, the epoch, that is the sort of start time that everyone agrees on, is the 1st of January 1970. So that's what we're going to measure. We just want to know how many nanoseconds have passed since that moment in time, and that's how we measure all times against each other. That's a lot of nanoseconds, but that's fine. We've got 64 bits, and we've got a lot of numbers we can wedge in there. So what I could do, for example, I could just say that the nanosecond time is equal to however many nanoseconds since 1970 it was at boot that we'll get from either NTP or we get it from the clock inside the computer itself. So we're going to say NS at boot, and I'm going to slightly wave my hands about that again because there are some nice computer files that explain how NTP works. But then we need to add the timestamp count, which I'm going to write as TSC, the timestamp count from this instruction, and then we kind of need to multiply it by some kind of thing that turns the frequency of the timestamp counter into nanoseconds. So in my case, in my computer, I need to essentially divide by 3 or multiply by a third. So I'm going to have multiplied by some kind of factor over here. That will give me the current time in nanoseconds. Fantastic. How do we get that factor? So at the beginning, what we're going to do is we're going to say that factor is 1 over whatever the chip says it is, 3 gigahertz, because 3 gigahertz, 1 gigahertz would be counting in nanoseconds. It's kind of bonkers to think about these things. But I don't want to use floating point maths. That's a pain. I don't want to actually use a third here. And neither does the computer. We know that integer numbers are faster, and it turns out that when you want to know what time it is, you often want to know what time it is, and you don't want to take a lot of time to find out what time it is. So you don't want to do lots of complicated maths, right? It's kind of an irony here.
When you asked me what time it was 12 o'clock, but it's not anymore.
It's now, 12:30 because it took me so long to work out it was 12 o'clock. Exactly. And, again, with the kind of, you can imagine how often all the programs on your computer say what time it is, either to display it or for their own internal measurements about things. So, and especially in my world, again, I want to know what time it is very, very often, nanoseconds apart, and kind of say, hey, how long did that take? So we want this to be fast, right? What we're actually going to do, and this sort of harks back to the divide conversation we had, is that we're going to pre-calculate some kind of multiplier that's an integer multiplier, and then we're going to have a divisor. And now if you remember, if we were to do this in decimal, what I might say is, for example, is why don't we multiply by 333, because multiplying is relatively cheap, and why don't we divide by 1000, so that effectively we're saying that 1/3 is approximately 333 over 1000. And dividing by 1000 for humans is easy. We just drop the last 3 digits. So I multiply by 333, drop the last 3 digits, and then I've kind of done a divide by 3 pretty cheaply. Now computers work in base 2, so there's some fraction in base 2, and then there's a shift by some power of 2 down to do the divide. So it might be, I should have checked this before we started recording, but what is 1/3 of 256? Sort of 80-ish, maybe, something like that.
85 or something like that, is it?
Yeah, so you could imagine we could multiply by 85 and then divide by 256, which is to say shift down by 8. So that would give us, and again, a multiply is not the cheapest thing we can do, but it's one of the cheaper integer things that we can do. So what we're actually going to do then is our ns at time is actually equal to the boot time plus the timestamp count times some factor, and then all of this down by some shift value here. That less than and less than there is like a C term to say shift down some number of digits. That is, throw away the bottom n bits. So that's cool. The problem with this particular equation, and it's pretty simple, right? We've got a couple of things here, is that we knew that the nanoseconds time at boot, but to your point about, the clock's moved on, we kind of, there's always going to be some kind of skew between those two numbers, right? And so what we really need to do is it was actually thousands and thousands of cycles in that we got to the point in the kernel booting and all the, the black screen with all the text coming up where it went, I think we should try and set up the clock now. And so obviously some amount of time has passed. So obviously there's some offset from boot when we first got the time. And this actually generalizes quite nicely because of two things that are about to happen. One is, once we've started up, we will probably discover the time wasn't quite right. Maybe we will talk to the internet. Maybe NTP comes along and says, actually, your clock wasn't right. You need to start adjusting it. And so we always want to have a way of offsetting the time based off of two things: the number of cycles at the point we last got a really accurate time, and then what that accurate time was. So our final thing becomes ns is equal to, and it's going to be some kind of time offset, that's like the last time we knew categorically what the real time was on the outside world, plus, and now we're going to do the time step count minus whatever the timestamp count was when we got this time. So we're going to say some offset here. And now that is multiplied by the factor and shifted down by the shift. And now we can adjust every time that we get a new accurate time, we can replace the accurate time and the offset, and now we're in a good space. But one thing I'd like to talk about is this factor here, because I just told you that like it might be off. And so one of the things we might have to do is fiddle with this factor. If, for example, I actually measured it this morning when I was here. So like my computer is 3 gigahertz, but it's actually currently 2999.999 megahertz, which is not 3 gigahertz, you may know. It's very, very close to it. But if I left it like that, I'd lose like 2 seconds a day.
The other thing is that, of course, a lot of modern chips will speed up and slow down for power saving reasons and things, won't they? So, I mean, are we putting that to one side for this anyway?
No. So that's an excellent point. Absolutely brilliant point, because it used to be in the very early incarnations of this RDTSC instruction, it did measure the clock frequency of the sort of prevailing core that you were on, which, as you say, goes up and down because CPUs go to sleep, CPUs sometimes burst up, like this is a 3 gigahertz machine, but it can burst up to 5 gigahertz, I think, at some times, if there's nothing else going on and there's one core that needs to do. And so it used to be a real problem. And then fairly soon on, because it was so useful to have a stable number, effectively there is a base clock that all of the cores use that doesn't change even if they all go to sleep or even if they burst up to 5 gigahertz or or whatever. So that makes life a lot easier. But what you can't guarantee is that clock is actually genuinely stable, because you heat stuff up and it starts to run faster or slower and all of that. So this wavers intraday. So it may be that it's just slightly wrong, like when my machine, I checked it this morning, it may be like just 2999.9999 is right, but also it might be that it's been idle all night and it's cooled down and now it's slightly lower. So the kernel, certainly Linux anyway, is forever going off to the internet and asking through NTP and other things, what time do you think it is? And then adjusting its idea about how fast that crystal is running relative. And so this factor will be slightly tweaked and knocked around just a tiny bit. Similarly, if it discovers the time is completely wrong, you could choose to update immediately, jump these offsets and times just to say, oh no, actually I was out by an hour or whatever, right? And I'm not talking about like daylight savings time here, because that's usually an offset that's applied after this. But NTP tends to try and just sort of waft things in the direction of correct, so there isn't a sudden discontinuity in the time. Otherwise, you look at the date of your time and you're like, wait a second, that time hasn't even happened yet, or it's like that's back in the past, I just made this, what's going on? So there's a lot of subtle things about this kind of stuff. So there's a couple of other things that are really interesting to me about this. The first thing is that, as I said, this is a calculation that I'd like to be able to do very, very, very quickly all of the time, because I forever ask the computer, what time is it? On Linux systems, you usually make a system call, which is an expensive operation. It's kind of like an interrupt. It kind of stops the whole thread of what's going on in your process. The CPU changes into a privileged mode. We've done things on this before now. And it's kind of a heavyweight thing to go to an operating system routine that now has privileged access to all of these special values that you could otherwise not change. Otherwise, you could imagine you could just change it and muck up the clock in unusual ways, right? That is what you would typically do. But it's so expensive that the Linux folks have come up with a clever trick where they actually map some code into your program, and they map these offsets there, the shift, the factor, the time, and the offset. These 4 values get mapped into a read-only area of memory that even an unprivileged program is allowed to read from, which is super cool, because now I can do this all in user space, provided I can get this timestamp count, and usually you can. And so you'll see that the libraries that say give you what the time is will just say, get me the timestamp count, and then do this very simple operation to get the actual wall clock time. And that takes 35 nanos, round about that amount of time. So it's not free, but it's pretty cheap. There's a whole other Computerphile video, I think, hiding in here as to how you can do that, because while you're reading time, offset, factor, and shift, it could be that the kernel is changing them. There's some clever trick that it does to make sure that's as cheap as possible, but maybe I'll leave that as a for another time teaser. And then, so there's another thing I'd like to just go on. So when I'm doing measuring of time, I don't care what wall clock time it is, because I only care about the difference between two times. So I only care that, like, I start a clock and it has the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and I don't care that that's 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 5 o'clock or 3 in the morning, right? It's just 1, 2, 3, 4. I do some work and I get the clock again. It's now 1, 2, 3, 8, and I'm like, oh, 4 units of time passed. And that's the thing that I care about when I'm benchmarking, when I'm profiling, when I'm trying to work out where all my time's going. So effectively that would cancel out this offset, this time here, but not the frequency and shift if I actually want to turn it into nanoseconds. So typically what you'll do is something like read timestamp count, some code here that I care about measuring, and then read timestamp count again, and then I can subtract, into say A, and this is into B, and then I do, time elapsed B minus A, and then this is now times that frequency, and down by the shift. And frankly, if I'm doing lots of calculations, I don't even need to do this, because if I just care about things getting faster or slower, I don't need to know if it's faster in nanoseconds or faster in clock cycles. As long as they're something I can compare, that's the main thing. So this is typically what we would do when we're like profiling code. And just a last thing on this specific here, because I think this sort of dovetails in with a whole bunch of other things we've talked about, is you very much understand and remember that computers don't execute the instructions in the sequence that I give them. Although I've drawn it nicely down here, the pipeline's filled with instructions, and we try and run the instructions that we can run because we know what their inputs are already, and or their outputs are clear. Now, register renaming means the output's always clear, but like, what does a read timestamp count instruction depend on? What does it have to wait for before it can start running if we see it way in the future?
It doesn't need anything, does it? Or does it need?
It does not need anything. No. So,
so is it going to do those two at the same time? Is that what you're saying?
It could easily choose to do that. Yes. So what might happen is that, like, you've got your divides in here and your square roots or whatever you've got going on in here, and the computer's like, well, this takes a long time. I'll kick those off, but hey, I can start this read timestamp counter already because it doesn't depend on anything before it. And then it turns out that it takes, like 33 cycles. You're like, that's amazing. That's super fast. And then you're like, but when I do millions of these back to back, it definitely takes more like 300 cycles. What's going on here? And it's exactly that. So that is a problem. It's something you have to think about, and it's like where the computer is sort of lying to you. And it's not even really clear what you mean, because, there is a variant of this instruction, RDTSC P, which is like a patched version. It's not, the P does not stand for patch. If I'm remembering my computer history here, Intel came up with this instruction, and then AMD added this one as a kind of version for them. And it does two things. It also reads another somewhat useful piece of information at the same time. But importantly, it says all of the instructions earlier than this have to have finished before this is allowed to start running. And so you get a better fence post here. So this would be an RDTSC-P. So that helps me understand that things are going on. But you may notice there's still a problem with this. So let's say we just turn these both into RDTSC-Ps. After this RDTSC-P, I've got loads of other code. What's to stop the computer going, oh, I can get ahead of myself here and I'll pull that into the benchmarked area? So it's not quite as bad, but code can leak into the benchmarked area and therefore cause microarchitectural pressure on things that you wouldn't otherwise care about. So typically there are some other serializing instructions that we would put either side of this. There's something called CPU ID, which is actually tells me what CPU am I running on. That's what it really means. But it also has the side effect of being completely everything before me and everything after me has to have stopped. It stops the whole CPU to tell you the answer of who it is. There are some other things to do with fences, to do with loading and storing memories that we put around these type of things. But it turns out that measuring time is a lot more difficult than you might imagine on computers. Over here, and we're going to have like the memory or RAM robot over here, which if I could draw a robot sheep, then it would be one of those. Obviously, all he does is he looks out, and every time he sees an address in the window in the room where the CPU is,